Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Forum of the Institute of Politics. I'm Charles Royer, Director of the Institute, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce as our moderator the representative of our co-sponsor for this evening's discussion on media coverage of the Gulf War, the editor of the Irish Times, Conor Brady. This is the first time that the Irish Times discussion or debate, which is now more of a colloquium, has been held at the Forum of the Institute of Politics. Over the past 6 years or so, the Irish Times has sponsored a debate, most often at the law school, and this is the first year in which that discussion has been held at the Forum. So we're delighted to have this opportunity with the Irish Times to bring you this discussion, and we hope it's the first of many such collaborations. Conor Brady has been editor of the Irish Times since 1986. He is the 11th editor of the newspaper since its foundation in 1859, at which time it committed itself to taking a wide perspective on world events while serving Ireland's particular needs as a newspaper of record. That commitment to a deeper understanding of international affairs has been reflected over recent years at the Irish Times by a number of developments. The opening in 1987 of Ireland's first news bureau in the Soviet Union, under the direction of Conor O'Clery, who is here tonight with us. The extension of the newspaper's network of international correspondence, and by the application of additional resources to the newspaper's role as a journal of serious international analysis and commentary. Conor Brady has worked for the Irish Times in Belfast at its London bureau, and as a reporter he covered assignments in Europe, Africa, and the United States. He took primary and postgraduate degrees in history and political science at University College Dublin and joined the Irish Times after graduation in 1969. Would you please welcome our moderator for this evening, Conor Brady.
Thank you, Director. Good evening, Mr. Ambassador, Madam Secretary, ladies and gentlemen. Any of you here last night at the discussion on the Bill of Rights? It was a good night, wasn't it? It kind of teed us up for some of what we're going to talk about this evening, because it touched a little on the role of the freedoms of the media, the freedoms of the press, and the functions of the press as it operates at times of great stress in a society. I kept on being reminded of the famous scene from a play by Tom Stoppard called Journey into Night, Day into Night, in which a young lady is protesting the lack of sensitivity of the Times of London and having reported her conviction for shoplifting in Harrods. And she's throwing the newspaper on the ground and stamping on it. And somebody says to her, "But surely, my dear, you believe in the free press." She says, "Of course I do. It's the damn newspapers I can't stand." The subject which we address here this evening is at the heart of the democratic process. The role and the function, the principles and the practices of the news media when free societies, the free societies which they serve, go to war. Where and at what point do correspondents, cameramen, women, editors encounter the pressures which say your country comes first, before your professional detachment, before your own judgment, and before the right of your readers or your viewers or your listeners to know the truth as best you can represent it? And how do they cope with these pressures? How do people in the news media deal with that situation? How do those in government or in authority seek to apply them? And when, and if those in authority succeed in applying those pressures, what is the cost to the body politic? Here in the United States, your Constitution explicitly safeguards the freedom of the media. Most European states, all EC states, proclaim and by and large give effect to similar freedoms, although frequently qualifying them with various executive powers. And yet, in the course of the Gulf War, I think it is fair to say, and it is accurate to say, a significant proportion of the media of the alliance countries, in the words of Robert Fisk, surely one of the best informed on-the-ground correspondents in the Middle East, in his words, most editors, correspondents and reporters came to attention, saluted and followed the flag. Perhaps it may be said that in doing so they saved lives. Perhaps they enabled the war to be brought to a swift conclusion. Or perhaps they allowed themselves to become an extension of an agenda among the powers of the alliance, an agenda which viewed war as inevitable and necessary. And if they did this, perhaps they have permanently damaged one of the central mechanisms of a free and democratic society, the perceived and viable and visible, I should say, independence of a questioning and unaligned media. It may be apposite to consider the words of the late John F. Kennedy, carved in stone in the memorial park close to this building, which a colleague of mine from our group drew to my attention earlier this day. He said, "The men who create power make an indispensable contribution to the nation's greatness, but the men who question power make a contribution just as indispensable, when that questioning is disinterested, for they determine whether we use power or whether power uses us." To discuss these issues this evening, we have 6 speakers of widely ranging backgrounds and experiences and viewpoints. Regrettably, Kate Adie of the BBC is unable to be with us because she's had to go on assignment to Turkey. However, we have with us in her place David Shukman, who is the defence correspondent of BBC Television. Joining him are Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT, Mr. Alexander Coburn, columnist at the Los Angeles Times and The Nation, Mr. Larry Speakes, who is a former chief spokesman at the White House, Mr. Hugh Culver, who is chief government spokesman at the British Ministry of Defence in London, and Mr. Paul Gillespie, who is the foreign editor of the Irish Times. And Paul Gillespie will be the first of our speakers. Paul Gillespie, as I say, is the foreign editor of the Irish Times. As such, he is responsible for all the foreign news content, for coordinating and directing the activities of overseas correspondents, and for the development of editorial policy in that area. He directed the newspaper's coverage of the Gulf War, and he implemented its editorial policy under the following principles: that the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was an act of unacceptable aggression, and that the first requirement was for an Iraqi withdrawal. Second, that any military action had to have the sanction of the United Nations and had to be confined to the terms of such resolutions as were to be ratified by the Security Council. And thirdly, that alliance forces ought not to extend their operations beyond the point which would be necessary to achieve an Iraqi withdrawal. Destabilisation of the Iraqi state or the extension of the war to achieve aims beyond the liberation of Kuwait were not considered acceptable. Paul has travelled extensively on foreign news assignments for the Irish Times. He's a graduate of Trinity College, Dublin. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Gillespie.
Ladies and gentlemen, our subject is media coverage of the Gulf War, journalism or Jingoism. War, according to Admiral William Crowe in congressional testimony last December, is a very uncertain proposition. It is not neat, it is not tidy, it is very messy. His remark makes a fitting preface to the subject under discussion this evening. It encapsulates the characteristics of war which drive governments and the military to censorship and ought to drive the media to redouble their efforts to inform the public in whose name it is being waged. The post-war situation in Iraq, culminating in the Kurdish disaster, bears out the wisdom of his remarks. The military campaign to drive Iraq from Kuwait was the first peace-enforcing war run under the mandate of the United Nations since Korea. This very fact made it all the more important that the world community be fully informed. The UN's involvement drew obligations from Ireland, a small neutral member of the European community with a strong tradition in UN peacekeeping, as well as for the United States, the superpower which emerged victorious from the Cold War and which was the driving force in the Gulf crisis. Sandwiched as we are in Ireland, between the British and American media and propaganda machines, the most enthusiastically belligerent of the coalition forces, it could be difficult to develop a perspective on the crisis. Irish public opinion and the government blamed Saddam Hussein for the war, supported the decision to take military action against him, but rejected any Irish military involvement. Three main questions arise for journalists from this experience: the proper relationship between democracy and the free flow of information in time of war, the broadening out of censorship from operational information to the control and manipulation of public opinion by state officials and military planners, and thirdly, the breadth and range of coverage both of the crisis and of the war. Now, the media have become much more central to democratic societies as sources of information, channels of dissent and watchdogs on authority, particularly in this century. Independence from the state and scepticism about the exercise of its power are the traditional hallmarks of good journalism in fulfilling these roles, although it is not difficult to be cynical about how they are used in practice. When such societies go to war, profound questions are presented for the state and the media alike. The Vietnam syndrome, which President Bush says has been licked, is in large part a media syndrome, after all. The standard Pentagon explanation for defeat in Vietnam blames it on a critical media coverage which undermined public support. It is at least a half-truth. It was therefore not surprising that the military planners should have sought to extend censorship from the traditional need to protect servicemen's lives, with which few journalists would disagree, to the need to ensure a compliant and supportive public opinion for the war effort. The device used was the pooled system of reporting adopted by all the coalition forces in the Gulf theatre. It gave the military potential control over what was written and over who was writing it, so that access and accreditation could be withheld from those who might be critical or refuse to obey the rules. Some journalists rejected this regime, but the vast majority of the media went along with it. The addition of uniforms on reporters staying with troops, insisted upon, as I understand, by the British military, meant, in the words of Robert Fisk of the London Independent, that some journalists behaved as if they were soldiers and not journalists, in vindication, indeed, of the charge of jingoism. Those who refused to cooperate could be denounced by colleagues, just as those who refused to drop the traditional obligation to balance the story by reporting from the other side, such as Peter Arnott in Baghdad, found themselves attacked for collaborating. Many journalists were only too willing to be censored when patriotic duty called. Fisk went on to argue, with reason, that generals will always blame the press for their failures, however much we bend to their rules. Ronald Dworkin, Professor of Jurisprudence at Oxford University, argues that when generals control the press in order to control public opinion, they are cheating on democracy. As a result, we had, in the main, a rather uncritical coverage of the war in most of the mainstream Anglo-American media. The sanitised high-technology aspect of television coverage, an entertainment spectacle, has been widely commented on. Not much of the bloody destruction, the waste, the blunders and the messiness of war seep through. But, as Dworkin argues, the people have a right, even a duty, to make up their own minds about whether they should be impatient or tired or frightened or appalled by a war, or whether their armies should risk bombing innocent civilians in air raid shelters. We cannot reduce the question of war coverage to that of censorship, however. The whole crisis was too narrowly framed in the media, which thereby lost sight of alternative means of getting Iraq out of Kuwait. The vote for war only just mustered a majority in Congress, we should remember, reflecting doubts in US society. The ineluctable surge to war, the rejection of negotiations and linkage, the underplaying of diplomacy which characterised the US and British government's approach were closely reflected in media coverage. Very often the wider political context, such as the precise role being played by the UN, was unexamined. The range of reporting from Middle Eastern countries was too narrow. The role of Western countries, including the US, in building up Iraq was under-examined, as was the real evidence for an Iraqi attack on Saudi Arabia, which provided the occasion to send the initial US force in. There is a danger that the understanding of the whole crisis, in being under- or misreported, has been distorted for governments and publics alike. Poor information leaves them unprepared for the political disasters which followed the great military victory. The media have redeemed themselves, free of censorship, in their reports on the Kurdish refugee crisis. These inconvenient facts about an inconvenient people have at least galvanised governments to act and to discuss more coherently a proper role for the United Nations, a necessary corollary at the level of international human rights of the actions taken on behalf of the international community against Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I should just point out, for anybody who isn't familiar with the format here, you see two microphones. When it comes to questions, and each speaker will have about 5 minutes, so we will have plenty of time for questions. People who want to put questions to any of the panelists, please go to these two microphones and form a line behind them, and I'll take the questions then in rotation from each side in succession. Our next speaker is David Shukman. He's the defence correspondent of BBC Television. He has reported recent events in the Middle East from Saudi Arabia and from the United Arab Emirates. And since the war, he has been reporting from Kuwait and from southern Iraq. He's a graduate of Durham University in England, and he has worked in Sudan and Uganda, and he has also worked for the BBC in Northern Ireland as a reporter for 3 years. He is at present co-authoring a book on the Gulf War to be published later this year by the BBC. David Shukman.
The Gulf War has the dubious distinction of being both the most covered but also arguably the most censored conflict in history. And some who hold the latter view in particular say that journalists like myself and press in general suffered. So I thought in my contribution I would just set out a few general remarks and observations about the context in which we operated, the political context that is, and how we set about covering the war. In Britain there was a broad political and public opinion consensus about the crisis. There were obvious fears, and there was pressure from some for sanctions to be given more time. But once troops were deployed abroad, opposition became more muted, and in this atmosphere most media organisations, mainstream media organisations like my own, the BBC, accepted the need that when it came to a war, if there was to be a war, there'd have to be some measure of censorship in the field. The BBC issued its staff with guidelines on reporting the campaign, the most important of which stated that we should withhold information if the military authorities could provide satisfactory reasons for us doing so. We had long and sometimes fraught arguments with the Ministry of Defence and other news organisations over how to pool material from the front line and the arrangements for that. But enough of these arrangements had been resolved by January the 15th for us to have a satellite dish and 2 teams in the desert. Independently and operating under different conditions, we had another team in Baghdad and many others around the rest of the Middle East. These extra teams in other countries and capitals not only enhanced our coverage in a general sense, but it also meant we could test and challenge Allied information. In particular, we could interview, for example, truck drivers coming through Iraq from Baghdad to Amman and hear about their accounts of being shot by American planes, for example. And we had people in place when the shelter was hit in Baghdad. The BBC also decided that British forces, and this was a major point of contention politically, that British forces should usually be referred to in broadcasts as British forces and not our forces. It seems a trivial point perhaps in this forum, but it aroused a great deal of controversy. Some Conservative Party members objected and said that in a war, we, the BBC, should not be seeking some kind of supposed objectivity, but that was our objective. And we feared that, as happened in the Falklands campaign, we could easily become the scapegoats for any Allied setbacks. In the event when the war actually started, the Prime Minister John Major made it clear that he wouldn't be drawn into criticising our efforts. But the public wasn't so restrained. The view most loudly proclaimed was that we were in danger of broadcasting too much rather than too little. Relevant information might have seemed sparse to us, but the main complaint from the public was that we were providing too much coverage. There was even a newspaper cartoon which depicted a bored couple sitting at home being bombed by television sets. That was the kind of background we were working against. It rather sets in context the debate about whether we got enough information. So the problem we had was that we had this major event which we felt obliged to cover with extra broadcasting time, but the event itself didn't generate the kind of information flow that really helped fill the extra time. So a few weeks into the air war, we cut back on our coverage until the ground offensive started. As to the arrangements themselves for coverage, it's very easy to criticise the media for being too compliant to the demands of the military. The fact remains that television in particular, it's a sad fact, but it's true, depends on access. And that means getting cooperation. It means getting agreement of some kind. It means doing some kind of deal or compromise. And as I said in my opening remarks, most major organisations within Britain, rightly or wrongly, accepted that. Many critics have said that correspondents who signed up to this deal lost their independence. We've heard about the point of reporters being in uniform. I personally have a problem with that, but editors in general in Britain did not. And it's certainly, I think, in my opinion, the case that a few journalists, in some instances, those who were attached to units, did give the impression of losing a sense of detachment. But it's worth pointing out that, again, from the Conservative Party, there was criticism that, in fact, a lot of our reporters remained too detached. The belief was that if a country went to war, the principal broadcasting and news organisations should put themselves right behind the forces in battle. The reality, of course, of operating in the desert meant that our TV crews needed the permission, the assistance and the protection of the military. Permission because it's too risky to be in an unmarked vehicle, unidentified, driving around in a battle. Assistance because there's no way that a TV organisation could match the logistics effort and keep a team supplied through hundreds of miles of desert. And protection because we don't have armoured vehicles. And that's obviously a prerequisite for covering a war. So as I say, we still, although we had an unprecedented amount of technology, which meant we could be very mobile, we still required access, we still required permission and assistance, and that meant cooperation, that meant compromise. And out of that, on the plus side, that meant bonds developed between the military and the media, which in certain circumstances were productive, trust developed, correspondents who are in the field with units, for the most part, said that by the end of their experience they felt that they were able to report much more freely than they'd expected to. On the other hand, of course, the military all the time had the ultimate sanction of being able to pull the plugs. I think our greatest problem came in the build-up to the war. We pursued wherever we could the whole issue of sanctions and whether they were working or not, but it's very difficult to obtain hard fact on that. And we had put possibly too much of an effort into getting teams into the desert in case the war started sooner than expected. The trouble was that for this period of the build-up in the desert, there was really nothing to report. So we ended up recycling, in my opinion, very much the same kind of story, which just said our troops are ready, they're itching to get into action or whatever, which does, on the scale of journalism, jingoism, veers towards certainly the middle of that spectrum, I'd say. I should add, though, and I had actually written into the script at this very point, that when I say that on the spectrum, it's worth bearing in mind that our newspapers, particularly tabloid, most popular newspapers, their coverage of the war, one could put very firmly at the extreme jingoistic end of the scale. That doesn't excuse anything that we did, but just to set that in context. This arrangement, for the most part, I think suited the military, because you do hear some in the military talking as if journalistic access to their activities is a rather tiresome favour to be granted, and others, of course, see us as a vehicle for safeguarding their future budgets. But there are those, running over time, there are those who do see that we have a job to do and endeavour to help us. I'll just finally end by saying, if I may, that the crucial thing about this whole experience was that the relationship between the military and the media was never put to the test properly. Really because the ground war ended much more quickly than anybody thought it might. The perceived wisdom was that the air war would be long and the air war short and the ground war long. In the end, there was never really any severe testing of the system. There was never any really major Allied setback that demanded a major row with broadcasters in the field. And our fear in the media is that the apparent success of media-military relations in some regards in this conflict will make it a model for the future. Thank you.
Sorry to have had to cut across David's time, but it's important that we try to keep, if we can, within the sort of 5 or 6 minutes for the speakers. Our next speaker is Alexander Coburn. He's a columnist with the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the Nation, to name but a few of his editorial outlets. He's an Irish citizen, educated in England, and he's been resident in the United States since 1973. He's published a number of books critical of dealing with American politics and power. He has been sharply critical of the role of the United States in the Gulf War and the events which led to it. And he has written and spoken extensively across the country on the role of the US vis-à-vis the Third World. Indeed, a reader of the Irish Times who happened to be in Houston, Texas, listening to the radio recently, taped Alexander Coburn one evening and sent him on to me. He was castigating various US media for their uncritical stance on the war and commending a number of other media, including, I was pleased to say, the Irish Times. But he went on to make the point that he thought the Irish Times had it just about right on the war because of its historical conditioning of the particular history of Ireland. It wasn't, he said, because the reporters of the Irish Times were particularly good or their editors were particularly brilliant. You can clearly see the flawed logic you're about to receive this evening.
Well, at least I understand now why I was invited to the forum. But it's true, and I think it's when we get into discussions of this nature about censorship and about journalistic coverage, sometimes it's too easy to get into the small nuts and bolts of press passes and pools, although these are, of course, important on what you hear. But the point I was making about the Irish Times, because the coverage in the Irish Times was good, as was the Sunday Tribune's, also in Ireland, I thought it did come from a historical background where there was a certain reservations about imperial claims and imperial pretensions, and I think this showed up constantly in the way material was selected. The coverage of the war, at first, there seems to have been an enormous plenitude. Month after month of relentless saturation coverage. And there was an interesting survey of the media done in Denver in early February where people found, actually, some researchers, that the more people had watched television, the less they knew. And I think this points at something that amidst the plenitude, how much did the coverage actually serve really to inform people about what was going on in a way that would advance democratic decision-making or democratic participation? And I think here the record is bad on the whole. I think the record is particularly bad on the most important thing of all. Some things were badly reported, but some things were barely reported at all, which was, could the war really have been avoided? And here we come to the question of what proposals was Iraq really making? What negotiating postures did it have, both public and semi-public, and actually private? And here there is a record, and it was reported on to a certain extent in papers like Newsday, but almost no wider currency was given, particularly in the network. So on the absolutely central area of debate, what should have been the central area in the pre-Christmas phase, we in fact knew very little. And we were told very little by the press, although the material was there, in which people could have said, well, there is a negotiating position here. I'm not talking even about linkage at this point, which was dealt with extensively by the press, usually in terms of brusque dismissal, but actually what the actual content of Iraqi proposals were. I think a second area, a very important area, was the actual unfolding of what in essence was a secret war. After all, immediately after the election, the President doubled the deployment and cancelled rotation. These were decisions consequent upon public decisions, public announcements consequent on decisions taken before the election. And I don't think the press actually, I think it could have dealt much more extensively and much more vigorously with what real preparations there were for war at a time when there was supposedly a public debate going on. And I think hand in hand with that came the moment when people suddenly stopped, the White House stopped talking about sanctions. Having said that sanctions would take time, suddenly we were told, of course, that sanctions had failed. And I think the press made not nearly enough of this. And again, hand in hand with that, really, I think the coverage of the UN and the actual, whether there were breaches of the Charter, in the, particularly in the United States press, and to a lesser extent in the British press, there was very little proper journalism on that. Although this is not a matter of censorship, this is not a matter of access, this is a matter of going and reading the Charter, which is, again, not a particularly difficult thing to do. Once when the US, I think, made a mistake, perhaps Larry Speakes might address this, and kept the press out of Grenada for a couple of days, they had to go away and read about Grenada and find out where it was. And I think investigative reading, it could be called. And It wasn't a bad thing. The UN, the role of the UN, and it was 678 an actual breach of the terms of the Charter? Had all other means been exhausted before force was used? This was barely discussed. And we came to the war itself. I think here, oddly enough, despite all the endless claims for technological virtuosity and the marvels of CNN's presence in Baghdad, actually a very, very shameful episode in the history of American journalism, not British journalism, I should say, in this instance. And I should disclose an interest. I have a brother, Patrick, who was in Baghdad for much of the war for the Independent. But almost all US journalists withdrew from Baghdad on or around January the 15th, leaving CNN. This was, in my view, a shameful desertion under the sort of urging of the Defense Department, and actually very often on the direct orders of publishers and editors who are now busily awarding each other Pulitzer Prizes for the coverage. But it was a shameful desertion, and I think it should be recognized as such. I think the actual coverage of the military aspects of the fight, some of it is, I think, summed up in Bernard Shaw's remark on the first night of the bombing when the CNN team were holding a telephone out the window, which was hailed as another example of technological virtuosity, while people looked at a photograph. And he said, have you noticed how every bomb is finding a target? Well, if you think about that for a while, I mean, what target? An orphanage or a military installation? I think people were under the glamour of that first night, and of course film carefully released by the Pentagon, as naturally they would. They will do what they have to do, and they released film showing a missile going in a window, and very dramatic it was too. How many films not showing missiles not going through windows were suppressed? People, I think, were seduced by the idea that somehow there was this idea of military precision. Whenever you hear the words military and precision linked, it's time for absolute cynicism. Perhaps like the working press. It's one of those phrases that come out of people's mouths without much mental negotiation, I think. But it's now emerging, of course, that the actual, even on the level of supposed technological triumph, the truth is rather different. I think the present figure is that 25% of the Patriot missiles actually managed to find their target. I think one estimate is that casualties in Israel went up from the Scuds after the Patriots were deployed. The final, I think, omission by the press was actually the final closing days of February. How were these really discussed? The truth finally was dealt with in some measure. But what in the end was a punitive massacre was, I think, once again ignored by the press. So I think in all phases of the conflict, when it comes to the background, when it comes to the content, when it comes to what the crucial decisions were, when they were taken, and how could they have been avoided, I think on that major level, without talking about access in the Gulf, on that level, I think we really have to look at a picture and a story of failure. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Hugh Culver. He has been the Chief of Public Relations at the British Ministry of Defence since 1987. He has been a journalist with the Financial Times. He joined the Ministry of Defence in 1975, has worked with the Prime Minister's office at 10 Downing Street, and also, believe it or not, at New Scotland Yard. He's very good at his job, I can assure you. He was not at the MOD during the Falklands War, and believe me, they could have done with him. He was with the MOD for the Gulf War, and I don't think he would disagree with me if I say that, by and large, that was a very different experience with the Ministry of Defence, leading on all points from the media nearly the whole way. Ladies and gentlemen, Hugh Culver.
Gosh, thank you very much for that introduction. I get the feeling this evening that I've been cast, as actually one of my fellow panellists just said to me, as the villain of the piece. And, well, I may, albeit briefly, live up to that. But I do want to say straight away that I am going to tackle it from a very particular point of view. And I think that that's the very particular point of view that you probably want from me, because there is a legitimate perception from, if you like, government and defence departments, where you have to remember that the prime objective is actually to win the war. Now, we're talking about journalism or jingoism. On January the 16th, I think it was, the Sun newspaper, which is a famous British tabloid newspaper of a certain kind, the one that I think David Shukman had in his mind when he referred to this end of the media. But on that day, this newspaper published this front page. Now, for those who can't see this front page, this is the Union Jack with the head of a soldier in the middle, wearing his beret, with the legend over the top, "Support our boys and put this flag in your window." And so they did, in households across the country, and indeed in cars that you saw driving in front of you on the road, in really remarkable numbers, 3 million or so perhaps. These flags appeared with the legend, "Support our boys." Now, though it might have been a little wheeze that somebody in my department might have dreamt up as a suggestion some way along in this campaign, it actually wasn't a suggestion that came out of government at all. It wasn't really a spirit in that way that came out of government at all. It was a feeling that came from a perception within the mind of the editor of The Sun that that is what the people wanted, and that that was the mood that the nation was supposed to have transmitted to it. And who am I to argue with that? I think we would say from our perspective, if you're in the business of fighting a war and getting into it, and I won't discuss how we got into it and all of that, but once that you're faced with it, the prime objective is to win it. On that basis, from my point of view, you need to gain public support. You need to gain a public support which the soldiers on the ground perceive in a very powerful way, and that they feel that they have the support of the people back home, especially when they're not fighting for their own soil. But you also, of course, need to maintain operational security. I'm sorry to be boring when mentioning that, but you do have to retain. It's terribly important in the interests of winning the war, winning the campaign, and not giving your positions and your capabilities and all of that away. Now, you can't do the first and the second without opening up your operations to the press. And so you arrive at what is not altogether, for everybody concerned, a happy compromise, but is a compromise in this very difficult situation of potential conflict between the press and the military, and if you like, governments fighting wars. And so we organised our pools, as has been said, we organised our ground rules, we organised the briefings. Actually, enormous amounts of information were given out. But of course, it's very difficult. Every journalist wants to be, if you like, on the spearhead, at the front, with a feeling of how it is all developing and how it is all going. Quite impossible to achieve. You can only achieve a little bit here and a little bit there, with the best will in the world. What we, the military, if you like, can't allow is, on a battlefield, is for journalists to roam free, pick up whatever information they can, and unwittingly, certainly not deliberately, put lives at risk by talking about who's where and who's doing what and what the plans are. The interesting thing for me about the whole Gulf War, apart from the fact that the plans, as far as we're concerned, did actually work reasonably well from our perspective, and I believe from many of the media's perspective as well, I think the thing that was interesting to me was that our constraints, or our potential constraints, about security and policy and information exercised nothing like the influence on the media, perhaps particularly television, that a perception about the public will placed upon them. They were much more, I believe, constrained by potential and actual audience reaction than they ever were by the concerns expressed from my department and from government in general. And I think that's a very interesting object lesson, and it's a very interesting example, if you like, of a kind of public jingoism translated through various points on the spectrum to the media, and very, very difficult for the journalist in that situation to adopt the usual and highly commendable quality of scepticism. People who are supporting their country in fighting a war do not want scepticism. They do not want to know about the failures. They do not want to know about the things that go wrong. It is a simple fact of life. Now, David is right to say that this particular situation did not, in terms of everybody's perception, go well. But the audience reaction, if I can put it in that rather prosaic sense, ruled the day, in my belief. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Our next speaker is Professor Noam Chomsky. He is the he is the author of so many books and papers on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, and contemporary issues that if I were to list them all, I would have people sending me up bits of paper to tell me to sit down. It is in his role as a leading intellectual voice in American world policy that what he has to say is most relevant here this evening. He is Institute Professor at MIT, a member of many professional and learned bodies in the United States and elsewhere. His books on US and Western policy towards the Middle East and towards Southeast Asia have had a profound significance in shaping public opinion and indeed in influencing administration policies and indeed the course of world events. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Noam Chomsky.
There are only a few minutes, and I would like to use them to concentrate on a small number of issues. Issues which seem to me central. They've already been touched upon. I'm going to keep pretty much to the period prior to the outbreak of the war. So the issue of the legitimacy of censorship under wartime does not arise. I don't mean to imply by that I accept the legitimacy of censorship in a conflict of this kind, which might not merit the term war. War is something where two sides shoot at each other. Nevertheless, let me put that aside and keep to the period prior to the war. At that point, no questions of censorship arise. Now, the decision to go to war is not a trivial matter. It's a serious decision, especially under the conditions of modern warfare. War is likely to be devastating, if not catastrophic. You may not be able to predict the details and respects in which it will be a catastrophe, but that it will be is a fair prediction. So you have to have very strong arguments. The burden of proof on someone who decides to go to war rather than pursuing the peaceful means prescribed by international law, that's a very heavy burden. And we therefore ask ourselves how that burden was addressed. To make it concrete, let's take the moment before the war, just right up to the war. At that point, polls indicated that the population of the United States, by about 2/3, 2-to-1, was in favor of a solution which would involve a complete Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait in the context of moves towards a regional settlement, specifically a conference on the Arab-Israeli issue. Now, the people, just put yourself in the position of the people who answered yes on that poll. It's a fair guess that none of them, or virtually none of them, were aware of the fact that only a few days before a proposal of that nature had been released by high U.S. officials. An Iraqi proposal had been released by high U.S. officials who described it as a serious negotiating offer indicating an Iraqi desire to withdraw from Kuwait under those terms. It's a near certainty that no one who answered yes on that poll was aware that others had the same position they do. That position had not been advocated in the media. In fact, hadn't even been discussed in the media. The orders from Washington were, you're supposed to be opposed to linkage, linkage being an Orwellism for diplomacy. You're supposed to be opposed to linkage, and virtually without exception, those marching orders were followed. The existence of the Iraqi proposal, released by high U.S. officials, incidentally, so we have no reason to doubt its authenticity, it was there in the press if you actually were a media freak. You know, you could find it. But virtually no one was aware of it. There was virtually no coverage of it. That had been the pattern since mid-August. There was a lot of debate over whether sanctions would work. However, that debate may well have been idle, because it's quite possible that they had worked. Maybe by mid-August, quite possibly by late December when these offers were released. At least that's one plausible explanation of the fact that there was a series of Iraqi proposals described by State Department officials as serious and negotiable from mid-August right through the time of the fighting, and in fact the fighting began and it continued. But those facts were unknown. So coming back to the people who answered yes on the poll, most of them, probably all of them, were unaware of the fact that such proposal, in fact, the exact proposal that they advocated was on the table, according to high U.S. officials, that it had been outright rejected by Washington without consideration, that other people like them believed it, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. Few could have been aware that this was a very common position throughout the world, including those parts of the Iraqi democratic opposition that at least I've been able to find any statement by. They are articulate people. These are people who had been fighting against this murderous gangster for years while George Bush considered him his great friend and the media were keeping quiet about the nature of that friendship. But they were also opposed to going to war because of the catastrophic effects that this was likely to have and the opportunities for a settlement which would involve total Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, as certainly was a necessity, but without the disaster that ensued. Again, that's something that Americans could hardly have been aware of, since the statements of the Iraqi democratic opposition, published in Germany and in England, not places that are all that obscure, these were, to my knowledge, completely unavailable in the American media. Except for people who happened to hear some of their spokesmen talk at teach-ins, few could have been aware of what their positions were. Well, now, as I say again, going to war is a serious matter. In a totalitarian state, the decision to go to war is made by the determination of the leader. In a democratic state, the idea is supposed to be that if the government decides to go to war, it'll present its reasons. The media have the job of presenting the relevant information and making it available, and ensuring that there's a forum for debating those issues. That didn't happen. It's a striking fact that no reason was ever presented for going to war, no official reason. Now, I don't mean that words weren't uttered. Words were uttered. The words were, we cannot deal with aggressors. Aggressors must be immediately punished. Aggressors cannot be rewarded. Now, that's not a reason. And the reason it's not a reason is very simple. George Bush doesn't believe a word of it. The people who repeated it don't believe a word of it. And we know that because they do not follow that alleged principle in any other case. They follow it when it suits their interest to follow it. They do not suit it when it doesn't fit their interest to follow it. As a result, we conclude by simple logic that that was not their reason. Whatever the reason was, it lay elsewhere, but that question was not explored. And let's be very clear about that. Again, I stress the seriousness of a decision to go to war. So, for example, suppose that someone were to propose now that the U.S. Air Force is free, it's finished bombing Baghdad, and it's refrained from preventing the forces that Saddam Hussein's forces from going on to crush the Shiite and the Kurds, an issue which one might explore. But now that it's free, why not start bombing Jakarta, let's say? or bombing Tel Aviv, or bombing a whole series of other capitals, including, I might say, Washington. These are all countries that have been engaged in aggression, and very serious aggression. So, of course, before you bomb Jakarta, it's going to be necessary for the United States and Britain to stop arming the murderers, as they've been doing for the past years. But Indonesia, for example, in its invasion of East Timor, has killed perhaps a quarter of the population, maybe about 200,000 people, with the fervent and strong support of the United States and the United Kingdom, who continue to arm them, as they continue. And in fact, right in the course of the war, Indonesia made use of the fact that attention was focused elsewhere to launch a new invasion in East Timor, not covered because not interesting. So therefore, we surely should bomb Jakarta. I mean, the killings are vastly beyond anything attributed to Saddam Hussein in Kuwait, maybe 100 times as high. Has been going on for years. No sanctions, no diplomacy. Got to bomb them. Or suppose the Air Force picked a closer target, let's say Tel Aviv. Israel is in violation, for example, of Security Council Resolution 425, which calls for its immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Lebanon. That's March 1978, so quite a few years have passed. That Security Council resolution followed an Israeli invasion in which about 2,000 people were killed and 250,000 refugees were caused. During that period, Israel continues to hold about 10% of Lebanon, using it as a base for attacking the rest of the country, terrorizing and torturing the region. During that period, it has carried out another invasion in which about 20,000 people were killed. So surely the time has come to bomb Tel Aviv. Now, and we could go on. Now, anyone who made these proposals would be regarded as some kind of Nazi. I mean, those are grotesque proposals. And the question that had to be answered is, in fact, those are pretty much the arguments that Saddam Hussein offered for sending Scud missiles to attack Tel Aviv. And we rightly regard them as sordid and grotesque. Well, the question that had to be answered is why the issue is different in this case. That question, maybe there's an answer, but that question was never addressed. No such reason was given. No such reason was discussed. It follows that no reason was given for going to war. Now, prior to the going to war, there were other issues that were not discussed. For example, the nature of U.S. support for Saddam Hussein for the preceding 10 years. That had been largely suppressed for 10 years. After it became, the orders came, you're supposed to hate Saddam Hussein, there was a spate of articles bringing up his sordid record, which is indeed grotesque, and bringing out some of the facts about U.S. support for them. Well, how does U.S. support for Saddam Hussein during these 10 years under George Bush's administration as vice president, as president, how does that relate to the current policy of the United States in refusing, as of now still, to have any dealings with members of the Iraqi Democratic Opposition, to release Saddam Hussein's forces so that they can crush Kurdish and Shiite rebellions, to move towards reinstating a situation in Iraq in which it will either be Saddam Hussein or some clone? That's where it's directing towards. Furthermore, still keeping to the period prior to the invasion, now it is correct, as Mr. Gillespie said, the press is reporting on the atrocities committed against the Kurds in Iraq. But those are not the only Kurds who are subject to atrocities. So in the period prior to the invasion, reports from Turkey, from human rights workers in Turkey, from medical aid groups in Turkey, from even groups like Middle East Watch, to the extent they can get information, reported extensive Turkish atrocities against Kurds. In fact, it appears that Turkey, very much like Indonesia, was using the focus of attention on the Gulf to accelerate its own repression of Kurds. And it was no joke. According to these reports, they were bombing villages and cities. Tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of refugees were created. This is just the months leading up to the invasion. No reporting, no interest. Those are not the right Kurds. The order hadn't come, you pick the Kurds who play an ideological role when you want to report it. Well, I can continue. I'll stop at this point. The point I'd like to make is that the crucial issues were never discussed. The reasons for going to war were never given. Pretexts were offered. They cannot be accepted for a moment as serious, meaning the reasons were never given. This is the very hallmark of a totalitarian society. And the fact that the media contributed to that result is something that should seriously trouble anyone who does not want to live in a totalitarian society.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Our last speaker from the panel this evening is Mr. Larry Speakes. Larry Speakes was chief spokesman at the White House for 6 years, serving in the administrations of Presidents Nixon, Ford and Reagan. He was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal by President Reagan and cited as a man the American people could count upon. He majored in journalism at the University of Mississippi. He has had numerous professional awards. He is author of the best-selling memoir, Speaking Out, and he is now a corporate communications consultant and a lecturer in politics and the press. Mr. Larry Speakes.
I'm anxious to see what Conor's notes say when he passes them up and you go overtime. The question of Grenada has been brought up, and I might tell you my perspective of the invasion of Grenada. One afternoon in my office, a reporter from CBS walked in and says, "I hear there's something going on down in the Caribbean around the island of Grenada. Can you check it?" I said, "Sure." So I picked up the phone and called a gentleman who later became famous in other ways, a man named Admiral John Poindexter. I said, "John, are we going to invade Grenada today?" He said, "No, preposterous." So I relayed that back to the CBS reporter. CBS didn't use the story. The next morning, U.S. troops went ashore of that tiny Caribbean island, and I was handed a sheaf of papers this thick and said, "Go out and announce the war." Well, I learned. Even we government spokesmen are sometimes persecuted and left out and uninformed. But I did learn. Next time you say, "Are we going to start a war today?" and the answer comes back no, you say, "What about tomorrow morning?" Someone in Washington once watched Sam Donaldson in action for a little while, and they concluded that if TV hadn't been invented, Sam would go door to door. Now, I think that's what's happening in our world today. Television has gone door to door around the world and into our living rooms. And nothing illustrates that more effectively than the recent Gulf War. I call it the prime time war. When the first bombs fell in Baghdad, and these were surely the shots heard around the world, as we witnessed the beginning of a war that at the very moment it was happening. The New York Times has concluded that this moment that should be answered. These include, how will the media utilize its rapidly developing technology? Can the media cope with budget cuts in the newsroom and still do its job? Are new professional standards and ethics needed to meet new situations? And finally, how does the media deal with the friction between the press and the government? And beyond these, there's probably a more important question, and that is, what is the future of the news business in an increasingly complex world where we have increasing demands on the time and attention of those who consume the news in this world of ours? Let's take a look briefly at these four subjects. Technology. As we know, instant communication is essential in today's modern news, for today's modern news coverage. And on the first night of the war, CNN scored a clear victory over its competitors with something called the four-wire. The four-wire was the electronic link that they had that no one else had that linked them to the world. And today, spurred by competitive instincts, the urge to go live leaves little time for thought and analysis on the part of the press. And there's a wide margin for misinterpretation and simply missing out on something that's going on. The media should never have to choose between getting it first or getting it right. Cost of coverage. Will the bottom line oriented corporate giants force news organizations to cover more news on less money? Will television retreat from its worldwide coverage? Will the networks instead rely on video news services such as CNN and other all-news networks? Will the print media resort to make paper reporting to fit the shrinking news hole? The media of tomorrow is going to have to establish new priorities to become more innovative in order to serve its viewers and its readers. Now, the question of new professional standards and ethics. With increasing media clout comes increasing responsibility. Where does one draw the line between impartial reporting, letting the chips of public opinion fall where they may, and reporting that provides interpretation and opinion necessary to understand the news? How do future Peter Arnett's decide when censorship becomes so oppressive that their reporting no longer reflects the truth? Today, television channels have become diplomatic channels, and the media serves as diplomatic couriers, electronically carrying messages of war and peace between capitals. And with that are these new responsibilities. Now let me go to government and the press. The question, can one cover the war from the confines of a press pool or a briefing room that's far from the action? Where is the line between legitimate news and national security? Both government and the press have an obligation to inform the public, for they are the ones that will ultimately decide if the right decisions were made. And finally, the question of the news business and its future. Today, issues have become more complex as attention spans grow shorter, and I mean not only of those who watch television and read the papers, but the news reporters themselves have short attention spans, and a story may continue to be newsworthy, but they're moving on to something else. Politicians today speak in sound bites, and entertainment is substituted for information. Will the media succumb to MTV formulas to provide information that affects our life and liberty? Or does the media have the responsibility to try to force feed the public news about environment or economics or infrastructure and other such vital issues they need to know about? Are they dealing with cotton candy? Are they dealing with meat and potatoes? Somewhere between lies the answer, and the media must adapt or the media will perish. My remarks here tonight are sort of like one of my White House briefings. Many are the questions and few are the answers. But the answers are elusive, and they do deserve thought. Politicians speak of defining moments, and the Gulf War, 43 days of it, is a defining moment for the media. The challenge the media faces is to face up to and surmount to this, what they find in their own new world order. It's critical. It's critical to the well-being of nations and their people. It's really critical to our civilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry Speaks. May I now invite those of you who would like to put questions to come to the two microphones. We have until 9:30. We're going to have to close on the button of 9:30, so we'll start. I think the gentleman on my right-hand side came.
Well, first of all,
I like your T-shirt, sir.
Yes. First of all, the Irish Times is an actual newspaper that you can buy right here in Harvard Square at Out of Town News. I'm interested. The two members of the panel spoke about everybody or nearly everybody feeling or thinking a certain way, as if this was some sort of objective reality that had no historical evolution to it. How did that, leaving aside the manipulation of polling, leaving aside polls that maybe indicated something quite different, I think it's really important to try to look at, to examine how it is that people came to feel a certain way or supposedly believe a certain way. I think there's a process in the media, so-called, where there's a lot of manipulation of this sense of what everybody supposedly thinks. As a specific example, at the conclusion of the war, so to speak, there were a lot of headlines about the euphoria in this country. I didn't see any of it, and yet it was taken as a fact that there was a national mood of euphoria. I didn't see it. So I wonder if any of the members of the panel could speak to this situation.
Well, I think... sorry, no, you go ahead.
Well, I think I know a lot of people, you know, personal and political friends of mine, tend to disbelieve the polls and think they're manipulated. I don't, really. I mean, I think the polls probably give a pretty accurate picture of exactly what they ask. Now, you have to look at the way the question is formulated. There are ways of formulating questions which can change the answer that comes out, but if you do it, you get a picture. Now, I think I do, you know, I know more, you know, my impressions about what we couldn't even talk about what people in this room believe, let alone what the country believes. But to the extent that one can have any kind of impression about that, my impression, based on lots of traveling around during this period, all sorts of out-of-the-way places, and mainly off the beaten track, is that reaction has a certain element of truth to it. I think the population was terrified. This is a very frightened country, extremely frightened country. It's been true for many years. There's a regular process of terrorizing the population with chimeras, to mention Grenada. Even Grenada was presented as a threat to our existence. You may recall that this dot somewhere off in the sea was supposed to have had an airfield which was going to attack the hemisphere. It was piling up Russian weapons.
It's called the nip it in the bud tactic.
Yeah, right. I recall hearing Admiral Thomas Moore, who was, I think, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, intoning away on television in a somber voice, or I guess it was NPR, actually, radio, how in the case of a Russian invasion of Western Europe, Grenada could be used to interdict the supply lines, from the Caribbean and prevent oil from being shipped to our... and the population was frightened. Then we won this amazing victory, and we were standing tall, as Ronald Reagan put it. And that's happened over and over. Libya was going to terrorize everyone. The tourism industry in Europe was destroyed because Americans were afraid to travel. Noriega was going to lead hordes of narco-traffickers to destroy our cities. Fortunately, we got there just in time and saved ourselves. Now, Saddam Hussein is a murderer on a level that puts those guys to shame. But even in this case, to present Saddam Hussein as a major threat to the United States was simply ludicrous. Nevertheless, it was done, and my impression is people were frightened. I heard, and you heard, General Schwarzkopf give briefings in which he explained how we were outmanned and we were outgunned and they had all this fantastic artillery, but we were going to fight anyway, and so on. And I think a lot of people felt, well, yeah, we were rescued, a miraculous rescue from Hitler, who was just about to conquer the world and destroy us. So therefore, in those circumstances, well, you feel a kind of euphoria and even awe and love for the leader. Incidentally, another notable feature of a totalitarian society, and a feature related, in my opinion, to something else that the media might discuss. This regular pattern every few years is very typical of a society where you have to distract people from what's happening around them. And what's been happening around them in the past 10 years, what's been happening around them for the past 10 years is that social policies have been pursued by the government, which have created a real disaster. I don't have to tell you what it's like. You can walk outside and see it. Now, if this is a free country, if people are going to pay attention to that, they may do something about it. And it's therefore very crucial that they not pay attention to it. And there's a classic mechanism for keeping people from paying attention to it. That's to frighten them, to give them cheap victories over defenseless enemies, after which they applaud and laud the great miraculous leader who has saved them from disaster. That's not unheard of. I'm drawing the lines more sharply than they might be drawn, but I think there's reality to this, and I think that relates to the euphoria, which I think was correctly reported.
But wasn't there something much more basic than that, in a sense, as well? Not just euphoria, but simple relief. People thought people were going to get killed in much larger numbers.
Yeah, well, there were about 200,000 Iraqis.
They were relieved.
And then a couple 100,000 Kurds and Shiites. Are they relieved? Mm-hmm.
I was interested in talking about the ground rules that were used in Vietnam, and I guess were basically universally accepted as being effective in preventing journalists from endangering the operational safety of the military in Vietnam. I wondered whether something had changed, whether the quality of the media had deteriorated so badly, or what it was exactly that required journalists to be arrested and held in custody and to have their passports held, and to have Robert Fisk, I think he managed to get to the front in the Persian Gulf War, and it was reported by another journalist that he was in a Jeep and he was at the front, and one of the journalists in the military pools reported this to the military, and they immediately took him back to Dhahran, I believe it was. This I have from a publisher of a well-known magazine who I won't mention. I wondered whether or not Chomsky or Coburn could address this particular issue, and whether you can tell me why it is that there were only 15 newspapers who were willing to join the Center for Constitutional Rights lawsuit against the Pentagon in its violation of the First Amendment freedom of the press, which had not just happened during the Persian Gulf War, but had happened in Grenada and Panama. And why was it that there were no major newspapers that were willing to join this lawsuit? Why was it that only people like Sidney Schanberg, E.L. Doctorow, Harper's Magazine, the alternative medias were willing to join in this lawsuit against the Pentagon when there was so many obvious violations of the freedom of the press? Chomsky or Coburn, please.
Well, let me just make one sentence and then I'll hand it over to Alex. My one sentence is, don't have any illusions about the coverage of the Vietnam War. The self-censorship during the Vietnam War led to circumstances every bit as bad as what we've just seen.
Well, very briefly, I think, Noam took the words out of my mouth, that the fact that there's a myth, really, which the press has taken upon itself, that somehow the press in the Vietnam period stabbed America in the back. They've allowed that to flourish as somehow validating the surrenders they subsequently made in going along with the increasingly refined pool system operated by the Pentagon. I mean, I'm talking about, of course, the U.S. The U.S. Trend here. And now I think Time and the major publications, the news weeklies, now say directly, there have been a few pieces where they say we should never have done it. Of course, after the event, they did do it. The suit that you allude to, they didn't join. And I've got no answer why they didn't join. The nation was party to that suit, questioning the pool rules. But it's hard to imagine now a condition when the press, which I think has now become so implicated in these various stratagems to suppress information, it's hard to imagine at what point they're going to stand out against it. Talking of again of the U.S. press and the British press to a certain extent. I should mention, by the way, that the person who called for Fisk to be arrested when he managed to penetrate to the front and report on what was going on at CAFG was a reporter for NBC Nightly News.
Questions as compact as possible, because
I have felt for some time that the press has been co-opted by the Reagan-Bush administrations, and I think after watching the Frontline documentary last week that it's even more serious than that. They're not only co-opted but seem to be enjoying it. There was a particular section or part in the Frontline documentary that showed a press conference where somebody asked President Reagan if he knew about what was going on, and he kind of winked and said, "No, I don't," and everybody in the audience, the press, laughed. And I just wonder if somebody could explain how this situation has come about, that the press is playing that role.
Larry, that seems into your...
Yeah. The question is about how come the press has rolled over and played dead, not how come the Reagan administration has done so. I don't think you can actually say that the press has been co-opted, and it certainly didn't look that way from the inside looking out when I was in government. We thought they were nipping at our heels night and day. I do think there is a real need for more discussions of this type, more opportunity for government and the press to sit down and talk. There has got to be some way to improve the flow of information, and at the same time have those who are in government, those who are in politics, not be afraid that everything they do, or a large portion of it, is going to be distorted in some fashion. There has got to be a good give and take between that, and I think the Gulf War has emphasized that it's important to do so. So I think that discussion and things of this type will improve that free flow of information.
Take the gentleman on the side.
I'd like to ask the panel how much the media's internal conflicts of interest have an effect on the reporting. For example, we know that General Electric owns NBC, and General Electric manufactures the aircraft engines for the fighters and also for nuclear weapons. That's just one example of many. So I'd like to hear some comment on that aspect of reasons for self-censorship in the press.
Anybody like to comment on that very, very quickly?
Well, I think that that's a special case of something much more general. And here again, with regard to the last question, I would also suggest that the right question is not how the press became this way, but why it's always been this way. And I think the answer is it's not so much that, General Electric, I'm sure, doesn't give NBC orders, but the point is they all have the same interest. I mean, the major media are simply major corporations, part of even bigger conglomerates, run by people who have a free flow up and back between the executive suite and government positions and places like the Kennedy School and so on and so forth. Now that's a sector of the population that's involved in social, economic, and political management. It's a privileged sector. They share the same interests. Of course, they see the same world the same way.
I'd add to that. I mean, actually, I rather disagree with Noam Chomsky. I think probably General Electric does give NBC orders on a fairly frequent basis. And secondly, I might add, if people are sort of connoisseurs of particularly bracing moments of conflict of interest, the recent CBS special on the troops, which I think was scripted by Roger Ailes, a well-known Republican media manipulator, was a fairly classic example.
Thank you. The gentleman on this side.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question to the press secretary for the British Ministry of Defense. I don't know your name, I'm sorry. The question is, did I understand correctly that you were suggesting that the public somehow didn't want to be burdened with certain types of information in the Gulf War about some of the distressing and perhaps annoying aspects of what was going on? And I'm curious how it is that you come to that idea, and isn't that in some way self-serving for those who might want to keep certain information from the public? And my other question is, I also understand you to say that had the public put more pressure or voiced more interest in knowing more, then they would have been able to have gotten more information about what was going on. In fact, it wasn't so much the military withholding information, just that the public didn't request it. Is that in fact true?
I'm not so sure about the last point, but I would agree with the first point. There was very clear pressure that came on all of us, and by all of us I mean those in government and those in the media. Whenever it was perceived that we crossed a certain line in terms of information flow or what was coming through that people didn't want to hear, there was a mini outcry, or at least there was a response. Letters poured in, for instance, to the Ministry of Defence saying, why are you giving so much valuable military information away to the media? Well, David and his colleagues would have been somewhat surprised, perhaps, to realise that. Also, when you had situations on television which people found, for one reason or another, unpalatable, maybe they just didn't want to see it, the switchboards would be jammed. And I think it was very difficult for the media to feel themselves needing to respond to the audience, but yet at the same time having to do their job. But there was a very tangible pressure from the public at large in this way. There's no doubt about it.
If I can just add, I mean, it is an extraordinary state of affairs in many respects, given the kind of debate we're having now, but it's perhaps a peculiarly British phenomenon, that the main tone of complaints that I got personally, that my employers got as an organisation, was that we were somehow betraying all kinds of secrets. And it led to endless, now apparently pointless debates within our own newsroom about whether I should do a feature on air-land battles, for example, to explain this military strategy that might come. We worried ourselves sick as to whether we were somehow giving away too much, which of course was a nonsense in retrospect. But I mean, we had this internal debate because there was immense public pressure. And the public pressure was almost entirely of the tone of, you're giving away too much, don't do it again.
Can I ask, actually, because David, I think, was involved in it, in the final carnage on the road to Basra, I mean, how great do you think the manipulation or the censorship was in suppressing the levels of destruction at that particular period?
Well, I don't think there was any censorship at all, because just at that very stage, the fighting as such had stopped. By the time that the TV crews got to the Mutla Ridge, pretty well the pool system had stopped. People were completely free to roam around that whole region and film whatever they wanted to. It was very dangerous because of unexploded bombs lying around. By that stage, we had our own satellite dishes set up in Kuwait City, completely independent of the military. So that aspect, that particular aspect of the war, was covered without any kind of control whatsoever.
If I can make one comment on that, I'm sure you're exactly right, and the same is true here. The press is also under pressure here, not to be traitors and so on. But recall that all that's against a background of assumptions. The assumption is we're at war, we're in danger, it's unpatriotic to, our troops and we are going to be in danger if you give aid to the enemy. Suppose the public had a different picture. Suppose the public had a picture which in fact is, look, it doesn't have to be a war. Furthermore, this isn't a war, it's a slaughter. Furthermore, it's being supported for reasons totally different from the ones that are being discussed. If that was the assumptions on which the public was facing the issue, you wouldn't get that kind of criticism. My point is that the propaganda war had already been won before the public ever reached you. You were getting the responses which were accurate of deeply propagandized people.
Sir, if your question is brief, I'll take it and I'll get a brief answer it because we have to close down.
Just a related question about what was being discussed is the shoot the messenger mentality. I mean, to Mr. Coburn, to be a devil's advocate to that, what if people do not want to hear that Americans killed 200,000 people and are going to lash out in response to that? What do you do in the face of that?
Alex, very briefly, you want to respond to that?
Well, you keep on saying it. I mean, and as Noam Chomsky said, you have to sketch in the overall situation. You have to give the background to the war and how it could have been avoided, and stake it on a larger terrain. Don't have your terrain constantly defined for you by the people who might want to censor you or stop what you're doing. That is the real duty of the press, to widen it out and say the things that haven't been mentioned at all.
There's obviously a lot more to be said on all sides on this thing. Time doesn't permit, I'm afraid. One thing I am going to do, I'm going to ask for a show of hands at this stage. How many people here believe that the media let you down in all of this? Well, I think that's fairly conclusive. I think that's fairly conclusive. I'm sorry, I am under strict orders to wrap things up. I'm going to have to leave it at that. Obviously, there's a great deal more to be said, but in what you're saying, in your show of hands, I think you've given a fairly definitive view. Thank you all for being with us.